In 1987, the Canadian Armed Forces maintained a network of 14 relay stations spread across the Arctic archipelago and the northern continental shelf. Most of these installations were legacies of the DW line era, repurposed, downsized, and largely forgotten by anyone who didn't rely on them for signal continuity. They existed to keep communication chains alive between early warning radar posts, naval surface assets in northern waters, and NORAD's regional coordination centers further south. Relay Station 12, designated RS-12 in operational correspondence, sat on the northeast coast of Ellesmere Island, roughly 80 kilometers from Alert. It was not a prestigious assignment. There was no combat mission. No intelligence tasking of note. RS-12's purpose was to receive, amplify, and retransmit high-frequency radio signals along the northern relay corridor. That was it. The station existed so that a transmission sent from a patrol vessel in the Beaufort Sea could reach Yellowknife without dying in the ionospheric noise that plagued Arctic communications during geomagnetic disturbance periods. The installation itself was modest. A central operations building, a reinforced modular structure, housed the communications equipment, a small command office, a galley, and a common area. An adjacent dormitory module contained sleeping quarters. A third structure held generators, fuel storage, and maintenance equipment. The three buildings were connected by enclosed walkways, because in February on Ellesmere Island, walking outside unconnected between structures wasn't a casual decision. Wind chill could reach 60 below. The sun wouldn't rise above the horizon for weeks. Manning at RS-12 followed a standard rotation, 12 personnel on a 4-month deployment cycle. This included a station commander, typically a captain or senior lieutenant, a deputy, 6 communications operators working in pairs on 8-hour watches, 2 maintenance technicians responsible for generators and antenna systems, a supply and logistics NCO, and a general duty corporal who handled cooking, cleaning, and facility upkeep. 12 people. That number is important. Everything that follows depends on the fact that at RS-12, in the winter rotation beginning January 1987, there were exactly 12 people. This was verified on deployment, verified on arrival, verified in the station log, and verified every morning at 0600 during daily roll call. It was this daily roll call, the most unremarkable administrative ritual in military life, that eventually became the center of an incident that, as far as official records are concerned, generated a 17-page internal review, 2 psychological referrals, 1 medical evacuation, and a revised operational manning policy for northern relay stations. The review was classified at a level that seems disproportionate for a communications relay post where nothing officially happened. I want to be careful about how I present this. The information comes from 3 sources: a partial administrative summary that was included in a 1993 batch declassification of routine Northern operations files, personal correspondence from 2 of the 12 personnel stationed at RS-12 during the relevant period, and a recorded interview conducted in 2004 with the station's deputy commander as part of a veterans' oral history project that was never published. None of these sources fully agree with each other. I'll note the discrepancies where they matter. The January 1987 rotation arrived at RS-12 on the 4th of the month via Twin Otter from Alert. The outgoing crew had already packed. Handover briefings were short. There was little to hand over. Equipment status, fuel reserves, the maintenance schedule for the antenna array, a note about a persistent ground fault in Generator 2 that wasn't dangerous but needed monitoring. The outgoing station commander mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that propagation conditions had been unusually poor for the past few weeks. Solar activity. The kind of thing that made relay work frustrating but not alarming. The incoming crew settled in. Captain David Elford took command. His deputy was Lieutenant Michel Tremblay, who had done one previous northern rotation at a radar site near Inuvik and considered himself reasonably adapted to Arctic service. The communications operators were Corporals Fenn, Blackhurst, Savard, Cormier, Park, and Whalen. Maintenance was handled by Master Corporal Gilchrist and Corporal Naismith. Sergeant Mackey was the logistics NCO. Private Doucette handled general duties. 12 names. 12 bunks assigned. 12 places at the galley table, though they ate in shifts since watch rotations meant someone was always in the comms room. Roll call at RS-12 was conducted every morning at 0600 in the common area. It wasn't elaborate. Captain Elford, or, in his absence, Lieutenant Tremblay would read through the roster alphabetically. Each person responded with their surname. It took under a minute. The purpose was simple accountability, confirm that everyone was present, alive, and functional. In an environment where someone could theoretically wander outside in a disoriented state and be dead within 20 minutes, accountability wasn't merely bureaucratic. It was survival protocol. For the first 11 days, nothing about RS-12 was remarkable. The operators maintained the relay schedule. Signals came in, were amplified, went out. Propagation was mediocre. Gilchrist and Naismith worked on the Generator 2 ground fault and replaced a corroded connector on the secondary antenna feed line. Doucette cooked meals that were nutritionally adequate and culinarily forgettable. People read paperback novels, played cards, wrote letters they'd mail at the next resupply. Tremblay noted in his personal log that the darkness was more total than he'd experienced at Inuvik, which was further south. He described it as being inside a closet that extended in every direction. On January 15th, during the 0600 roll call, Captain Elford read through the roster. Everyone responded. He noted the count, 12, and dismissed the group to their duties. It was Corporal Fenn later that morning, who mentioned something to Corporal Blackhurst during their watch. He said the roll call had sounded off. Blackhurst asked what he meant. Fenn couldn't articulate it precisely. He said it felt like there had been a response that came slightly after one of the names, not quite an echo but something layered underneath. He compared it to when two people accidentally start speaking at the same time during a radio check. A doubling. Blackhurst hadn't noticed anything. Fenn dropped it. On January 17th, it happened in a way that was harder to dismiss. Tremblay was conducting roll call that morning. Elford had been up late dealing with a communication from Regional Command regarding a schedule change. Tremblay read the names. Each person responded. When he finished and looked down at his roster to mark attendance complete, he paused. He counted heads in the room. 11. Corporal Park was on watch in the comms room, which was standard. The on-duty operator was excused from physical presence at roll call and confirmed via intercom. 11 bodies in the common area. Park on intercom. 12 total. Correct. But Tremblay told the oral history interviewer, 17 years later, that he'd heard 13 responses. I didn't think 13 at the time, he said. I just thought the count didn't feel right. Like when you're counting cash and your fingers tell you the stack is thicker than the number you reached. I read 12 names. I heard 12 answers. But something in the room felt like it added up to more. He didn't raise it with anyone that morning. He described feeling vaguely foolish about even noticing. January 18th. Roll call. 0600. This time Captain Elford was present and conducting. He read the names. Responses came back in the usual clipped, half-awake voices. Elford reached the end of the list. Marked attendance complete. Then Corporal Savard said, "Sir, who was that?" Elford looked at him. Who was what? Savard hesitated. He said he'd heard a response after Elford had finished. Not a name exactly, but a voice. Like someone answering a name that hadn't been called. He said it came from the back of the room, near the entrance to the walkway that connected to the dormitory module. No one was standing near the walkway entrance. Elford looked. The door to the walkway was closed. Two other people, Cormier and Mackey, said they might have heard something but weren't sure. Blackhurst, Fenn, Whalen, Naismith, and Doucette reported hearing nothing unusual. Gilchrist was in the maintenance building dealing with a fuel line issue and had checked in via radio, not intercom. Elford's response was measured and procedural. He recounted heads. 11 present in the room. Gilchrist on radio. Park on watch. 12. He told the group that acoustics in modular structures could be deceptive, especially when wind conditions created pressure differentials. He dismissed everyone. That explanation was reasonable. The common area was not a well-insulated room. Wind against the exterior panels created low-frequency resonance that could plausibly produce auditory artifacts. No one had reason to doubt this. But Tremblay noted in his personal log that evening, second time, didn't seem concerned. I'm not sure I am either. But I'm writing it down. Over the next several days there was no recurrence during roll call. Operations continued normally. The relay handled routine traffic. A supply delivery arrived on the 21st, fuel, food stores, replacement parts for Generator 2 mail. The supply crew stayed for 4 hours, ate a meal and departed. Their presence was mundane, but Tremblay mentioned in his oral history that it felt good to see different faces. A reminder that the outside world still existed in a concrete, physical way. On January 23, the station received an unusually dense block of relay traffic related to a naval exercise in the Beaufort Sea. The communications operators worked extended shifts. Fatigue increased. Fenn and Blackhurst pulled a double watch when Savard reported feeling ill, a stomach complaint that Mackey, who had basic medical training, attributed to something in the recent supply delivery. Savard spent a day in his bunk and recovered. Roll calls during this period were brief and unremarkable. 12 names, 12 responses, correct count. Whatever Savard had heard on the 18th seemed to have been an isolated incident. On January 27 it came back. Elford was reading the roster. The room was quiet. Outside, wind speeds were approximately 60 kilometers per hour, not extreme for Ellesmere, but enough to create a constant low hum against the building's exterior. Elford called Blackhurst. Blackhurst responded. Elford called Cormier. Cormier responded. And then, according to 4 separate accounts given later, there was a voice. It didn't say a name. It didn't form a word anyone could agree on. But it occupied the precise rhythmic space where a roll call response would go, after a name before the next name. It had the cadence of an answer. The duration. The tonal quality of a human voice responding to authority. Clip. Functional. Almost bored. Elford stopped reading. He looked up from the roster. The room was still. 11 faces looked back at him. Park's intercom was open but silent. Park later said he'd heard nothing from the comms room. Who spoke? Elford asked. No one answered. I need to know who spoke out of turn. Silence. Tremblay described Elford's expression in that moment as controlled but recalibrating. Like a man who expected a reasonable explanation and was adjusting to the possibility that one wasn't coming. Elford finished roll call. 12 names. 12 responses that he could attribute to specific people. He noted the time, made a notation in the station log, the first official written mention, and continued with the day. His log entry read, 0602. During accountability formation, unidentified vocalization observed by multiple personnel. Source undetermined. Assessed as environmental acoustic artifact. No action required. That's the language of a competent officer making a reasonable determination. Environmental acoustic artifact. 4 words that file the incident and close the drawer. But the drawer didn't stay closed. January 28th. Roll call. Elford conducting. He read slower than usual. Tremblay noticed this. Each name delivered with a fractional pause afterward, as though Elford was listening to the silence between responses, measuring it. The roll call proceeded normally through 8 names. Then Elford called Naismith. Naismith responded. And before Elford could call the next name, Park, who was physically present that morning, off watch, a voice responded. This time 5 people heard it clearly. Tremblay described it as present. Just the word present. Spoken at normal conversational volume from inside the room, in a voice that didn't belong to anyone he recognized. Not dramatically different from the others, not deep, not distorted, not whispery. Just an additional voice. One that sounded like it had every right to be there. Elford immediately said, "Count off." This was a standard accountability technique. Rather than calling names, each person counts sequentially. First person says, 1. Second says 2. And so on. They counted off. The count reached 12. 12 voices for 12 people. Elford had them do it again. Well, he looked at the room. He looked at Tremblay. He said, "Dismissed," and went to his office. Tremblay followed. He described the conversation that followed as brief and professional. Elford asked Tremblay if he had heard the voice. Tremblay confirmed. Elford asked if Tremblay could identify the speaker. Tremblay could not. Elford said he was going to review the station's communication equipment for any possibility of signal bleed, a radio transmission from another station inadvertently feeding through the intercom or PA system. This was a rational approach. RS-12's communication equipment, while functional, was not new. Cross-channel bleed was a known issue in aging HF installations. It was entirely plausible that a fragment of incoming radio traffic could route through the intercom system and produce a momentary voice artifact during a quiet moment like roll call. Elford and Gilchrist spent the afternoon of the 28th inspecting the intercom system, the PA circuit, and the interface between the communications equipment and the building's internal wiring. They found nothing anomalous. The intercom and the HF relay systems were on separate circuits with no shared pathways. Gilchrist was thorough. He was a methodical technician who didn't like unexplained electrical behavior. He told Tremblay that evening that the systems were clean. There was no mechanism for signal bleed. Elford accepted this finding and moved to his next hypothesis: wind-generated acoustic resonance. Relay Station 12's modular buildings had known acoustic characteristics. Metal panel construction, hollow wall cavities, long enclosed walkways. These could act as resonance chambers under certain wind conditions. Low-frequency sound, particularly in the 50 to 200 Hz range, could create psychoacoustic effects including perceived speech-like patterns and ambient noise. This explanation was scientifically sound. It was also, Tremblay noted, the explanation Elford seemed to prefer. Not because it was necessarily correct, but because it was addressable. If the problem was acoustic, you could install dampening material, seal gaps, adjust ventilation routing. It was a problem with a solution. Elford requested that Gilchrist and Naismith perform a structural acoustic survey of the common area and connecting walkways. This was done on the 29th and 30th. They identified several points where wind could generate resonance: panel joints, ventilation grills, the walkway junctions, and applied sealing foam and acoustic dampening where possible. On January 31st, roll call was conducted as usual. The voice was there. It's worth pausing here to note something about the way the RS-12 personnel described this period. In the correspondence I've seen and in Tremblay's oral history, there's a notable absence of dramatic language. Nobody describes terror. Nobody describes panic. The dominant emotional tone is irritation, the frustration of competent people confronting a problem that resists their competence. Elford was annoyed. Gilchrist was professionally offended that his acoustic survey hadn't resolved the issue. The operators treated it as an administrative nuisance. This is significant because it establishes how these individuals processed the experience initially. They weren't primed for the paranormal. They weren't horror enthusiasts looking for ghosts. They were technicians, soldiers, and bureaucrats trying to fix a malfunction in their daily routine. The shift from irritation to something else happened gradually, and it didn't happen to everyone at the same rate. February began. The sun was still below the horizon. It wouldn't return until mid-February, and even then only as a brief smear of orange light at noon that felt more like a rumor than a sunrise. The station operated under artificial light around the clock, which had a flattening effect on everyone's circadian rhythm. Sleep patterns were managed through discipline, assigned rest periods, restricted caffeine after 1800, limited use of recreational lighting in the dormitory. These protocols existed because Arctic isolation had well-documented effects on sleep, mood, and cognitive function even without unexplained anomalies. Elford instituted a new procedure on February 2nd. Roll call would be recorded. He placed a standard cassette recorder on the table in the common area and ran it during the 0600 formation. The reasoning was straightforward. If the voice was an acoustic artifact, the recorder would capture it, and analysis could determine its source characteristics. If the recorder captured nothing, it would suggest the phenomenon was perceptual, something happening in the listeners rather than in the room. February 2nd roll call. Recorded. 12 names, 12 responses. No anomalous voice observed by anyone present. February 3rd. Recorded. Same result. Clean. February 4th through 8th. All recorded. All clean. Elford began to relax. Tremblay noticed this. The prevailing theory settled into place. The acoustic dampening work had addressed the resonance issue, and the few remaining incidents in late January had been residual perceptual expectation, people hearing what they'd become primed to hear. A textbook example of confirmation bias in a high-stress, low-stimulation environment. On February 9th, Elford discontinued the recording protocol. He noted in the station log that the acoustic issue had been resolved through structural modification. On February 12th, during an unrecorded roll call, the voice returned. This time, Corporal Whalen, who had never previously reported hearing it, heard it clearly. He described it as coming from directly behind him, close enough that he turned around expecting to find someone standing at his shoulder. There was no one there. The nearest person behind him was Sergeant Mackey, who was standing 3 meters away. 7 of the 11 people in the room reported hearing it. Tremblay went to Elford's office afterward. He told the interviewer in 2004, "I suggested we resume recording. David, Captain Elford, agreed, but he looked tired. Not sleepy. Tired in a different way. Like a man who's realized the problem he thought he'd solved has been watching him celebrate." Recording resumed on the 13th. February 13th through 18th, roll calls recorded. No anomalous voice detected by personnel. Recordings reviewed, nothing unusual on the tapes. February 19th, roll call recorded. No voice heard by personnel during the formation. However, when Elford reviewed the tape that afternoon, he called Tremblay into his office. He played the tape. Tremblay heard the 12 names and 12 responses, and then at the very end, after Elford's voice said "dismissed," there was a sound. Tremblay described it as a response to nothing. A short vocalization, 1 or 2 syllables, in the cadence of a roll call answer, occurring approximately 2 seconds after the last legitimate voice on the tape. It was faint. It was partially masked by the sound of chairs moving as people stood up. But it was there. Elford played it 4 times. Tremblay heard it each time. They brought in Gilchrist, who listened with a technician's ear. Gilchrist heard it on the second play. He said it sounded like someone answering a question that was asked in another room. That phrase appears in Tremblay's oral history and in one of the personal letters. I think it's the most accurate description of what the RS-12 personnel were experiencing. Not something loud. Not something dramatic. Something displaced, occupying the right shape of sound in the wrong location of reality. Elford sent a report to Regional Command on February 20th. The report described persistent acoustic anomalies during daily accountability formations and requested technical assessment. The language was carefully neutral. He did not use the word voice. He described unattributed vocalizations consistent with environmental resonance patterns. Regional Command responded on the 22nd. They acknowledged the report and indicated that a technical team could be dispatched during the next scheduled resupply, approximately March 5th. In the meantime, they recommended continued monitoring and documentation. 13 days. Elford had to manage his station for 13 more days before anyone from outside would even look at the problem. It was during this waiting period that the psychological character of RS-12 began to change. The shift wasn't sudden. It accumulated like frost on the inside of a window, so gradually that you couldn't identify the moment it started, only the moment you noticed it had covered everything. Corporal Park began sleeping with his headphones on, not listening to anything, just wearing them. When Fenn asked about it, Park said the dormitory was too quiet. This was an odd complaint. The dormitory had never been quiet. Generator vibration, wind noise, and the building's thermal expansion created a constant low-level soundscape. But Park seemed to mean a different kind of quiet. A listening kind. Sergeant Mackey, the logistics NCO, developed a habit of counting. Not obsessively, not visibly. Tremblay only noticed because he shared a table with Mackey at meals. Mackey would count the plates, the chairs, the people in the room, always arriving at the correct number, always seeming slightly unsatisfied with the result, as though correctness itself had become suspicious. Corporal Savard requested permission to skip roll call on February 24th, citing a headache. Elford denied the request. Accountability formation was mandatory. Savard attended. He stood in the back of the room with his eyes fixed on the floor and didn't look up until it was over. The communications operators began keeping their headsets on during off-duty hours. Not monitoring, just wearing them. Fenn described it to Blackhurst as preferring controlled sound. Blackhurst understood. When you wear headsets, you know the source of every sound you hear. There are no ambiguous noises. No unattributed voices. Tremblay noticed that conversations in the common area had become shorter. Not hostile, just economical. People said what was necessary and then retreated to their bunks or their duties. The card game stopped. The paperback novel stayed open to the same pages for days. Doucette, who had been the most socially active member of the crew, began eating his meals in the galley standing up, finishing quickly and leaving. These changes were individually minor. Collectively, they described a station that was turning inward, each person constructing a smaller and smaller perimeter of normalcy around themselves. Elford maintained composure, but Tremblay observed changes in him too. He began conducting roll call faster, reading names in quick succession as if trying to leave less space between them. Less space for something else to fill. He also started arriving at the common area 10 minutes before 0600, standing in the room alone, listening. Tremblay walked in early on the 25th and found Elford standing in the center of the room in the dark. He hadn't turned the lights on. When Tremblay asked if he was all right, Elford said, "I'm establishing a baseline." He turned the lights on and didn't explain further. The recording from February 26th is the one that features most prominently in the administrative summary. Roll call proceeded normally. 12 names, 12 responses. No anomalous voice heard by any personnel present. Elford dismissed the group. When the tape was reviewed, the extra voice was there, but not at the end. It was inside the roll call. Between Cormier responding and Elford calling Doucette, there was a response. A voice saying what might have been a name. Not Cormier. Not Doucette. Something else. Gilchrist attempted to isolate the sound using the limited audio equipment available at the station. He played the segment on a loop for the better part of an afternoon. His conclusion, delivered to Elford in a written note rather than a verbal report, which tells you something about the atmosphere at RS-12 by this point, was that the voice was consistent in frequency, timbre, and cadence with the other responses on the tape, meaning it sounded like one of them. It sounded like a person standing in that room, responding to their name during a military formation. But it wasn't any of them. It didn't match any of the 12 voices when Gilchrist compared it to their individual responses on the same tape. It was close enough to be human, close enough to be male, close enough to be someone in that room, but not identical to any specific person. Elford sent an updated report to Regional Command on February 27th. This time his language was less neutral. He described an unidentified 13th vocal signature present on accountability formation recordings, and requested an expedited technical visit. He also requested guidance on whether the matter warranted a formal incident report. Regional Command's response, received on March 1st, was 4 sentences long. It acknowledged the updated report. It confirmed the technical team would arrive on March 5th as scheduled. It instructed Elford to continue daily recordings. And it directed him not to distribute copies of the tapes outside the station. That last instruction struck Tremblay as unusual. He mentioned it in his oral history. They didn't say the tapes were classified. They just said don't share them. That's a different thing. Classified means the information is protected. Don't share means someone doesn't want the information to move. March 1st through 4th. Roll call continued. Recorded every day. The voice appeared on the tapes for March 2nd and 4th. On the 2nd, it occurred after the final name, a trailing response like someone arriving late. On the 4th, it occurred twice, once between Fenn and Gilchrist, and once after Whalen, the last name on the roster. No one heard it during the formations themselves. It existed only on the tapes. This detail disturbed people in a way that the audible occurrences hadn't. When the voice was in the room, it was a shared experience, unsettling but communal. When it existed only on magnetic tape, it suggested something about the nature of the phenomenon that was harder to frame. The tape recorded what was there. If the voice was on the tape but not in their perception, either the tape was capturing something they couldn't hear, or the tape was being affected by something that bypassed the room entirely. Gilchrist favored a technical explanation. Magnetic tape is susceptible to electromagnetic interference. Arctic environments produce significant electromagnetic activity, geomagnetic storms, ionospheric disturbance, auroral electrojet currents. It was possible, he argued, that electromagnetic fluctuations were inducing patterns on the tape that coincidentally resembled vocal signals. The human brain, wired for pattern recognition, would then interpret these patterns as a voice. This explanation was defensible. Elford adopted it. In his log entry for March 4, he wrote, "Continued anomalous magnetic artifacts on accountability formation recordings. Likely attributable to geomagnetic activity consistent with current solar cycle. Technical team arrival March 5 will confirm." Corporal Cormier, however, pointed out a problem with this explanation at dinner that evening. If the artifacts were caused by geomagnetic interference, they should appear randomly distributed across the tape, during any point of the recording, during silence, during speech, indiscriminately. Instead, they appeared exclusively during roll call, in the rhythmic pattern of a roll call response, in the precise gaps where a response would occur. Cormier wasn't a scientist. He was a communications operator with a community college diploma. But he understood signal patterns and he knew the difference between noise and structure. What was on those tapes wasn't noise. It was structured. It followed rules. Elford didn't respond to Cormier's observation. He finished his meal and went to his office. The technical team arrived on March 5 aboard a twin otter that also carried routine supplies. The team consisted of 2 people, a communications systems technician, Warrant Officer Brandt, and an electronics specialist, Master Corporal Liu. They were there for a 2-day visit. Brandt and Liu conducted a thorough inspection of the station's communications and electrical systems over the course of March 5 and 6. They tested the intercom circuit, the PA system, antenna feed lines, HF receivers and transmitters, generator electrical output for signal contamination, and the recording equipment itself. They brought their own cassette deck and ran parallel recordings during the March 6 roll call. One on the station's recorder, one on their equipment. Neither recording contained an anomalous voice. The March 6 roll call was clean. 12 names, 12 responses, nothing else. Brandt and Liu reviewed the earlier tapes. They confirmed the presence of the anomalous vocal signature on the dates Elford had identified. Liu spent several hours with the tapes and the station's limited analysis tools. His written assessment, excerpts of which appear in the administrative summary, described the anomalous signals as coherent vocalizations of undetermined origin, consistent with human speech in fundamental frequency and form and structure, not attributable to known electromagnetic interference patterns. In simpler language, it sounds like a human voice and we don't know where it's coming from. Brandt told Elford privately, Tremblay was present, that he had no technical explanation. The systems were clean. The environment, while electromagnetically active, didn't produce the type of structured interference found on the tapes. He recommended that the tapes be sent to a laboratory facility for detailed spectrographic analysis. He also said something that Tremblay remembered precisely enough to quote 17 years later, "Captain, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly. Is there any possibility, that someone on your crew is doing this deliberately?" Elford said no. Not defensively. Flatly. He had considered it. He had considered it extensively. A practical joke, a morale disturbance, a deliberate effort to generate an evacuation. He had watched his people during roll call. He had varied the recording equipment's placement. He had conducted 2 unannounced roll calls at irregular hours. The voice appeared when it wanted to appear. It didn't conform to the presence or absence of any specific crew member. Brandt accepted this. He and Liu departed on the afternoon of March 6. The tapes went with them. After the technical team left, something shifted at RS-12. Not because of what Brandt and Liu had found, but because of what they hadn't. As long as the problem was undiagnosed, there was hope it was diagnosable. A wiring fault, a shielding gap, a fixable malfunction. Brandt and Liu had removed that hope. The systems were clean. The explanation wasn't technical. Tremblay described the following 2 weeks as the long quiet. Roll call continued every morning. The recorder ran. The voice did not appear, not audibly, not on tape. For 14 consecutive days the formations were completely normal. But the station wasn't normal. The behavioral changes that had been emerging in February solidified. People stopped using the common area outside of mandatory formations and meals. The walkways between buildings, previously treated as casual corridors, became spaces people moved through quickly, without lingering. Naismith told Tremblay he didn't like the sound the walkway made in the wind, a statement that was architecturally unremarkable but seemed to carry more weight than its surface meaning. Sleeping patterns deteriorated. Tremblay compiled a list of who was awake at irregular hours by noting who he encountered during his own late-night walks. He developed insomnia himself and took to pacing the operations building in the small hours. Over a 10-day period, he encountered every member of the crew awake at least once between 0200 and 0400. Some of them were working. Fenn claimed he was catching up on maintenance logs. Some were just sitting. Park, on 2 occasions, was standing in the common area in the dark, doing nothing. When Tremblay asked what he was doing, Park said he was listening. He didn't specify for what. Elford instituted a buddy system on March 15th. No one was to be alone in any part of the station. This was framed as a safety protocol related to winter conditions, not an unreasonable policy in itself. But everyone understood the real reason. The buddy system meant accountability. It meant knowing where each person was. It meant there were always witnesses. The operational quality of the relay work remained professional throughout this period. Whatever was happening to the crew psychologically, they maintained their mission. Signals were relayed. Maintenance was performed. Reports were filed. Tremblay credited this to training and institutional habit. When everything else becomes uncertain, the routine becomes an anchor. March 22nd. The voice came back. Roll call. 0600. Elford conducting. Recorder running. 12 names called. 13 responses. This time it wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't trailing or faint or buried under chair noise. Every person in the room heard it. It occurred after Mackey responded and before Elford called Naismith. A voice, clear and unremarkable, said what sounded like "here." Elford stopped. The room was silent. 11 faces and the open intercom connecting to the comms room where Whalen was on watch. Elford looked at Tremblay. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He said, "Count off." Slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 in the room. Whalen on intercom, 12. 12 voices. Correct. Again, Elford said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Whalen 12. 12. Always 12. The count was always correct when they counted. The extra voice appeared only during the roll call format, only when names were read and responses were expected, as though it was answering its own name, a name that wasn't on the roster. Elford dismissed the group. He went to his office, closed the door, and contacted regional command on the HF radio. The communication was logged, but its content is not included in the declassified summary. Tremblay, who was in the comms room during the transmission, said Elford spoke for approximately 20 minutes. When he emerged, he told Tremblay that a review team would be arriving within 72 hours and that in the interim roll call would be suspended. Tremblay asked if that was wise. Accountability formation was a daily requirement under station operating procedures. Elford said, "I'll account for everyone by head count. I'm not reading that roster again." It was the only time Tremblay heard Elford come close to sounding affected. For 3 days there was no roll call. Elford performed visual head counts at meals and shift changes. 12 people. Always 12. The review team arrived on March 25th. It was larger than the technical team. 5 people, including 2 individuals from a unit that Tremblay could not identify. They wore Canadian Forces uniforms but no unit insignia, and they didn't introduce themselves by anything other than first names. The other 3 were a medical officer, a communications specialist, and an administrative officer from Northern Area Headquarters. The review team's activities over the following 4 days are partially documented in the administrative summary, though significant portions are redacted. What is known? Each of the 12 RS-12 crew members was individually interviewed by the unidentified personnel. These interviews lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours. Tremblay's lasted an hour and 20 minutes. He described the questions as clinical, focused on what he'd heard, where he was standing, what he'd been thinking, how he'd been sleeping, whether he'd experienced anything similar before, whether he had any history of auditory irregularities. They asked about his family medical history. They asked about his dreams. The medical officer conducted physical examinations of all 12 personnel, including blood draws and basic neurological assessments. The purpose was not explained in detail, but Tremblay assumed they were screening for environmental factors, carbon monoxide exposure for example, which could cause group auditory hallucination. The station's CO detectors were tested. Levels were normal. The communications specialist reviewed all recordings in a temporary workspace set up in Elford's office. He brought his own equipment, spectrographic analysis tools that were significantly more advanced than anything at the station. He worked alone and did not share his findings with RS-12 personnel. On March 27, the review team conducted a roll call. They asked Elford to read the roster exactly as he normally would, with all 12 personnel present in the common area. Multiple recording devices were positioned around the room. The 2 unidentified personnel stood in the back corners watching. Elford read the roster. 12 names. 12 responses. No 13th voice. The review team conducted a second roll call that afternoon. Again, nothing unusual. A third on the morning of the 28th. Clean. Tremblay noted that the unidentified personnel seemed neither surprised nor disappointed by the lack of anomaly. They conducted their observations with what he called practiced neutrality, the demeanor of people who had done this type of work before and expected variable results. On March 28, the review team departed. They took all recordings with them, every tape RS-12 had made since February 2nd. The administrative officer left Elford with a document that Elford described to Tremblay as conclusory guidance. Tremblay never saw the document. Its contents aren't in the declassified summary. What Tremblay did learn, because Elford told him, was that the station's remaining deployment period would be shortened. The normal rotation date was early May. The crew would instead be rotated out in mid-April, approximately 3 weeks early. The reason given in the official rotation order was operational scheduling adjustment. No reference to the voice, the tapes, or the review team's visit. The final 3 weeks at RS-12 were, by all accounts, professionally unremarkable. Roll call resumed under Elford's headcount-only format. He never returned to reading names aloud from the roster. Accountability was maintained through visual confirmation. The relay mission continued. But the people were different. Corporal Fenn submitted a request for reassignment to a non-isolated posting. Corporal Park stopped sleeping in the dormitory entirely. He slept on a cot in the comms room, surrounded by equipment noise. Sergeant Mackey's counting habit expanded. Tremblay once observed him counting the ceiling panels in the common area and then counting them again, arriving at the same number both times and still looking dissatisfied. Private Doucette, the youngest member of the crew, became almost entirely nonverbal outside of duty requirements. He performed his tasks, cooking, cleaning, facility maintenance, with mechanical precision and an expression that Tremblay described as preemptively blank. Elford maintained command authority but seemed to have contracted inward. His log entries for the final weeks are terse, procedural, and devoid of the analytical commentary that characterized his earlier writing. He stopped noting weather conditions. He stopped recording morale observations. The entries are bare accountability confirmations. 12 present, operations normal, no incidents. The only exception is an entry from April 8 that reads, conducted PM head count. 12 confirmed. Common area thermostat checked. Temperature normal. Checked again at 2300. Still normal. There's no context for why he was checking the thermostat. The temperature hadn't been an issue at any prior point. The rotation crew arrived on April 14th. Handover was conducted efficiently. Elford briefed the incoming station commander on equipment status, fuel reserves, and outstanding maintenance items. He did not, according to Tremblay, brief the incoming commander on the voice. When Tremblay asked about this omission, Elford said, "It's in the log. He can read the log." The 12 personnel departed RS-12 on April 15, 1987. The aftermath is documented unevenly. Elford was reassigned to a headquarters position in Ottawa. He never served at a northern station again. He retired from the Canadian Forces in 1994 at the rank of major. He declined to participate in the Veterans Oral History Project and, according to the project coordinator, responded to the invitation with a single-sentence letter, "I have nothing to contribute to this subject." It's unclear whether he knew the project included other RS-12 personnel. Tremblay remained in service until 1998. He completed the oral history interview in 2004, which is the most detailed first-person account available. He was reflective but restrained. He said the experience hadn't traumatized him in a clinical sense, but that he'd never fully been able to hear a roll call, any roll call at any formation for the rest of his career, without counting the responses. "I always counted," he said. "Every single time. Even at formations with 200 people. I counted." Corporal Savard was medically evacuated from the station in late March. This is in the administrative summary, though the date is listed as March 21st, which is before the review team arrived. Tremblay's account places Savard's departure with the review team on March 28th. The discrepancy isn't explained. Savard's medical evaluation referenced acute stress response in a confined operational environment. He was reassigned to a base in southern Ontario and left the forces 2 years later. The tapes were never returned to RS-12. The administrative summary references them as having been retained for technical analysis by an office whose designation is redacted. No results of this analysis appear in any declassified documentation. A 1998 request by a Canadian Forces historian to access the tapes for a project on northern operations was denied on the basis that the materials were not relevant to the scope of the inquiry, which is an unusual reason for denial, because it doesn't say the tapes are classified or restricted, just not relevant. Someone made a determination about what the tapes were relevant to, and that determination isn't documented anywhere accessible. Relay Station 12 itself continued to operate through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. It was decommissioned in 1993 as part of a broader consolidation of northern communication infrastructure following the end of the Cold War. The physical structures were abandoned in place, as was common for remote Arctic installations where the cost of removal exceeded the value of the materials. The incoming rotation crew that replaced Elford's team, the 12 personnel who arrived on April 14, 1987, served a standard 4-month deployment without reported incident. Neither did the subsequent rotation. Whatever had occurred during the January-April period did not recur in any documented form. Or rather, it wasn't documented again. Whether it recurred is a different question, and one that the available records don't answer. I want to close with something Tremblay said near the end of his 2004 interview. The interviewer asked him what he thought the voice was. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the interviewer started to ask a follow-up question, and Tremblay interrupted. "I don't know what it was. I've had 17 years to think about it and I don't know. I've considered everything reasonable. Equipment malfunction, electromagnetic interference, group psychoacoustic effect, carbon monoxide, shared stress hallucination. All of it. None of it accounts for the tapes. The tapes are the part one can't get past. Because I can doubt my own ears. I can doubt 12 people's ears. I can't doubt magnetic tape. Tape doesn't have expectations. Tape doesn't have stress responses. Tape records what's there." He paused again. "The thing that bothers me, the thing I keep coming back to, isn't that there was an extra voice. It's that the voice knew the format. It answered when it was supposed to answer. It followed the rhythm. It was participating. Like it belonged there. Like it had always belonged there and we just hadn't been counting correctly." He looked at the interviewer. "There were 12 of us. There were always 12 of us. I'm certain of that. But sometimes certainty isn't the same thing as truth." Relay Station 12 was formally struck from the Canadian Forces Installation Registry in 1997. The structures remain on Ellesmere Island, sealed and deteriorating. A 2011 environmental survey team that assessed abandoned military sites in the Arctic archipelago noted RS-12's condition as structurally compromised but intact. They spent 4 hours at the site, documented the building's exterior condition, and departed. Their report contains one anomaly. In the section for personnel observations, a standard field where survey team members note anything relevant to site conditions, one team member wrote a single line: "Acoustic environment inside main structure unusual. Intermittent low-frequency vocalization-like sounds observed, likely attributable to wind and structural resonance." Likely attributable. That word, likely, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The administrative review of the 1987 RS-12 incident remains partially classified. No explanation for the classification level has been publicly released. The tapes have not been located in any archive accessible through standard records requests. 12 people were stationed at Arctic Relay Station 12 during the winter of 1987. 12 people were there. The records confirm it. The roster confirms it. The head counts confirm it. Everything confirms 12. Except the tapes. And the tapes are gone.